Welcome back. In the first half, we reviewed the Federal Reserve series of disastrous policy mistakes over the past 2 decades and explored the deep-seated institutional problems behind them. Today, we'll delve deeper and examine a core cornerstone of the Fed's monetary policy framework, a theory they hold as their guiding principle, the inflation expectations theory. First, we need to clarify what this technical-sounding theory actually means. Simply put, the Federal Reserve and most central banks around the world believe that people's expectations of future inflation are a key factor in determining actual future inflation. The theory posits that if a central bank can successfully convince businesses and individuals, through its rhetoric and actions, that future inflation will stabilize at 2%, then people will factor this 2% expectation into wage negotiations and product pricing. This expectation will then become self-fulfilling, helping the central bank to anchor actual inflation at its 2% target. This sounds rather esoteric, a bit like psychology rather than economics. This theory gives the Federal Reserve a powerful ability to guide the economy through expectations management and forward guidance. Powell reiterated this belief in his recent speech, saying, "We believe our commitment to our 2% target is a key factor in helping to keep longer-term inflation expectations well anchored." This theory is the emperor's new clothes the Fed uses to explain and justify most of its policies. But the question is, do these new clothes really exist? In other words, the key issue is not whether the Fed itself has the ability to keep inflation below 2%, but whether everyone believes in its ability. Shockingly, the most fatal blow to this theory came from within the Fed. In 2021, a senior Federal Reserve economist named Jeremy B. Rudd published a 27-page research paper with the provocative title, "Why Do We Think Inflation Expectations Matter to Inflation? And Should We?" In this paper, Rudd used detailed academic arguments to reach a striking conclusion. Let me quote a few translations from the original article. "Direct evidence supporting the expected inflation channel has never been strong. Mainstream economics is rife with ideas that everyone believes to be true, but are in fact complete nonsense." He also quoted economist Galbraith's famous quip, "It is far better and safer to have a firm anchor in nonsense than to sail on the turbulent seas of thought." This is tantamount to the Fed's own researchers publicly declaring that the emperor has no clothes. Using rigorous academic language, he explained that one of the core theories underlying the Fed's entire monetary policy framework has an extremely shaky foundation, and, from this perspective, resembles the workings of a dictatorship. In addition to internal academic skepticism, data and common sense also relentlessly challenge this theory. In his article, analyst Mish created a chart comparing consumers' inflation expectations for the next year with the actual inflation rate. This chart reveals 2 subversive facts. Fact 1. Expectations are useless until inflation actually arrives. From 2014 to early 2021, for 7 years, Americans' inflation expectations remained stable around 3% or even higher for most of the time. During this period, the Federal Reserve pulled out all the stops, including multiple rounds of quantitative easing, in a desperate attempt to push inflation back to 2%, but each attempt failed. Actual inflation hovered mostly below 2%. This clearly demonstrates that no matter what people expect, they can't create inflation out of thin air. Fact 2. When inflation actually arrives, expectations are a lagging indicator. When inflation peaked at 9.1% in 2022, inflation expectations slowly climbed to 5.5%. Then, even as actual inflation peaked and fell, expectations continued to climb, reaching their peak 8 months later. This clearly demonstrates that so-called inflation expectations are not a forward-looking indicator of the future. They are simply a lagging summary of people's shopping bills over the past few months. People's expectations are catching up with reality, not shaping it. Second, let's talk about common sense. For the theory of inflation expectations to hold water, it must assume that people will alter their current spending behavior based on their expectations of the future. This is crucial to understand. For example, if people anticipate significant price increases, they will stockpile goods. But let's use common sense to ask, to what extent is this possible? In his article, Mish poses a series of simple yet unanswerable questions to the originators of this theory, such as, the largest components of our living costs are housing, food, energy, and healthcare. Together, these account for over 80% of the CPI. If you expect rent to increase next year, would you rent 2 apartments now? If you expect gas prices to rise next month, what else can you do besides fill up your tank? Would you buy hundreds of gallons of gas and store it at home? If you need surgery, would you undergo it twice this year because you anticipate higher costs next year? The answer is obvious. The vast majority of our daily expenses are inelastic. Our consumption behavior is driven by current needs, not by vague expectations about the future. We don't eat twice as much food because we anticipate rising food prices, nor do we turn down the heat because we anticipate lower electricity bills. So, how do inflation expectations affect wages? Theorists assume that workers will demand raises based on their expectations of future inflation. But what is the reality? In 2023, when United Auto Workers President Sean Fine led a strike, his rationale was straightforward. Over the past 4 years, the average price of a new car has increased by more than 30%, and these gains have not been shared with workers. See, he was talking about price increases that have already occurred and the erosion of workers' purchasing power, not some academic forecast of future inflation. Workers demand raises to compensate for losses they've already suffered and to keep up with the already rising cost of living, not to negotiate for preemptive pay increases based on some Federal Reserve economic model. There's a natural mismatch between what happens in the real world and the timing set in the economic model. Now, we can draw a conclusion. The inflation expectations theory, espoused by the Federal Reserve, is likely nothing more than an illusion, woven into economists' models and profoundly disconnected from the real world. But this isn't just a harmless academic error. This flawed theory has extremely dangerous, real-world policy consequences. It was precisely because of their mistaken belief that as long as inflation expectations were anchored, everything was under control that they dared, even when inflation was clearly out of control in 2021, to insist that this was only temporary and continue with their extreme policies of zero interest rates and quantitative easing. The justification they repeatedly emphasized at the time was that long-term inflation expectations remained well anchored. But as we all know, the massive amount of money printed broke through the dam built by the Fed's slogans and confidence, resulting in disastrous consequences and a significant damage to the Fed's credibility. It can be said that their own theory blinded them, causing them to miss the best opportunity to control inflation and ultimately forcing them to aggressively raise interest rates at the fastest rate in 4 decades, which dealt a massive blow to the entire economy. Friends, today we've spent 2 episodes deeply dissecting the Fed's decision-making mechanisms and theoretical foundations. What we see is an institution riddled with historical errors, held hostage by outdated theories, and increasingly subject to political pressure. This serves as a profound warning to every investor. We can no longer simply and blindly trust the old adage, "Don't fight the Federal." The Fed itself may not even know what's truly right. In the future market, we need to learn to examine their every word and analyze their every decision with a more critical and independent eye. History has repeatedly proven that when the conductor's score is wrong, the first to suffer are always those who believe in him most. The above is my personal opinion only, not investment advice. Thank you for your company.